And we're going to talk about two types of fallacies and about different types of faulty argument techniques. The difference between the two is important because, well, basically there's two types of fallacies. There's formal fallacies, by which we mean that there's a lack of proper connection between the premises and the conclusion. If you remember that critical thinker's two-step, right? The first step is always checking whether if the premises were true, the conclusion had to be true or is more probable to be true than not. That the first fallacies we're going to talk about, those formal fallacies, focus on that step. So there's a lack of connection between the premises and the conclusion. All right? Yes, and the second type of fallacy is a substantive or informal fallacy, which focuses on that second step of that critical thinker's two-step. It's not about the connection between the premises and the conclusion, but it's about a general assumption that people make in these cases about these types of topics that is unjustified. So there is a connection between the premises and the conclusion, but it relies on an improper assumption. So you could say that those type of fallacies usually are could be valid and they could be forceful, but they're not sound. Misleading argument techniques can be both. There can be a proper connection, so it can be valid or forceful, and it can also be the case that it's a sound argument. But the way in which that argument is offered is misleading, right? So, for example, in a red herring, I could give you a good reason to believe something, but I'm stressing different topics that might lead you astray from the thing that you would actually want to have discussed. Or in a straw man or straw target, it has been changed in the book recently, in a straw target argument, it's not necessarily that I'm giving you bad reasons to accept a conclusion, but the way in which I represent the argument is misleading in itself. So that's why we call these misleading argument techniques and not a different type of fallacy. All right, so remember there's three categories that we're going to talk about. So one is formal fallacy, lack of connection between premises and conclusion. Second is substantive fallacy. There is a connection, but it relies on an unjustified but general assumption. And faulty argument techniques that might be inductively or deductively sound arguments, but are presented in a misleading way or to mislead you during a debate, for example. You can, as I just talked about, there's three types of pseudo-reasoning: formal fallacy, substantive, and misleading argument technique. I listed everything here, and I've indicated what the issue is with every type of pseudo-reasoning, and different examples of forms of pseudo-reasoning that fall within that category. So it's a very easy quiz because now I tell you that we're going to focus on the formal fallacies. So you already know within which category you need to seek the answer. All right, here we go. I am charged by an ethics board. If I'm charged by an ethics board, then I did something unethical. I am not charged by an ethics board, therefore I did nothing unethical. So let me know what type of formal fallacy we're talking about, right? Did you recognize here?
Denying the antecedent.
Right. Why do you think it's that one?
Because you're denying charged by the ethics board, that's P, then it did something wrong, or unethical is Q.
All right. That's clear. Thank you. Good answer. Right. So there it is, the answer to the question. Yeah, I'm not very good in hosting quizzes, as you can see, but a good answer. There should be more of a build-up, right? So if you put it in standard form, if I'm charged by an ethics board, then I did something unethical, as indicated just now. I am not charged by an ethics board, so not P, therefore not Q, which is an invalid form of reasoning that you should be on the lookout for. All right, let's go to the next. All right, so one way of thinking about it, or one way that this should make sense, if you say P, if P then Q, as we talked about, P is sufficient but not necessary for Q to be true. So even though when you can affirm P, so if you can affirm the antecedent, you can affirm the Q as well. As P is sufficient but not necessary, being necessary literally means that without P, Q can still occur. So that's one way of thinking about why this argument is invalid, because in a way because P is not necessary for Q to be true. So even without P, Q can still be true. All right. And you can also, if that was too abstract, you can also put it in the tree diagram we talked about, right? So in a tree diagram, you list all the possibilities. So someone is either charged or not charged, and in combination with doing something unethical or not doing something unethical. And if we then apply the rule, if someone is charged by an ethics board, then that person did something unethical. One situation is excluded, right? So you can scratch this possibility because you know if you're charged, then you did something unethical. So this option should be scratched from all possibilities, right? It's impossible for somebody to be charged and not have done something unethical. That's why we cancel this possibility. Oh, and then these are the remaining possibilities that are still possible given if P then Q. And then you can check it out, right? So if you then confirmed I'm not charged by an ethics committee, then that can either mean that you did something unethical or that you didn't do anything unethical. Still, the conclusion is the same. This is why it means that the argument isn't valid, because the conclusion about doing something unethical or not doesn't necessarily follow from the premises. I hope this makes it more intuitive. If not, you can still learn the form by heart and learn to recognize it. All right, creationism is very much true because it predicts that 10,000 years ago people were already living on Earth. Science has proven that that people indeed already lived on Earth in that time. So, again, the question is, what type of formal fallacy do you recognize? What helps, I tried to make it somewhat more difficult, this example, because the if-then relationships were less explicit than in the previous example. So it helps if you translate it, as you were doing, from what is written here to the if-then statements, and then it becomes more easy to recognize that indeed the consequent is being confirmed here. Thank you. All right, so as you might remember, again, Q in the relationship between if P then Q means that Q is necessary for P but not sufficient for P to occur. Sorry, that should say P here. So that doesn't mean that as soon as you can confirm Q, P is true as well. That's what not being sufficient means. All right. Again, you could also use a tree diagram if that was a bit abstract. And you start again with all possible situations. Creationism is true or not. And there were humans 10,000 years ago, which I summarized with the phrase old humans for some reason. So, and if we then apply the rule if creationism then old humans to this diagram, then we know that this situation is excluded, right? So it's impossible for their creationism to be true and there not to be humans 10,000 years ago, so we can scratch that. And then we can test whether confirming Q has any implications. Well, not really, because the fact that there were human beings 10,000 years ago doesn't necessarily imply that creationism is true. Creationism could be true, but it could also not be true, given that we affirmed Q in this case, given that we've affirmed that there were humans 10,000 years ago. All right, I hope this helps. It's another exercise with using this tree diagram, which might be useful if all else fails, if you don't recognize the exact form. All right, another example of confirming the consequent. We already talked about this, right? So strictly speaking, this is the reason why you can't confirm the predictions from your theory, or why it is, logically speaking, not very interesting to confirm the predictions from your theory, right? As we saw with the bouncing balls and frog example, it might be very well the case that if somebody experiences positive effect, then you show this type of brain activity. I've seen this type of brain activity. That doesn't necessarily mean that this is a case of positive effect taking place, right? That will be confirming the consequent, and that's why poppers strive towards falsification. Because if you deny Q, you can deny P as well. If you falsify your predictions, you can say with logical certainty, there are some caveats here, which we're going to talk about in the second and mainly the third block, but you would ideally be able to conclude with logical certainty that your theory is not true. All right, it's a good topic for a question. So, if precognition doesn't exist, it is impossible for performance on this task to deviate from what you can expect on the basis of chance. People perform better than chance at this task, logically we can deduce from this that precognition exists. This reasoning can be best described as the following reasoning form. Is it A, the modus tollens, B, the modus ponens, C, denying the antecedent, or D, confirming the consequent? The modus tollens basically is if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P, right? And I think in your explanation you said it differently because the original statement denies both terms, and that makes it perhaps more confusing. So let's see if why this is valid or not. So we can use that tree diagram again. So we have all situations here, if precognition is true or not, and there's a deviation from chance or not. And then we apply the rule, if not precognition, then not deviation from chance. So if we're here, this block has to follow it. So it's impossible for precognition to be untrue and to observe a deviation from chance, is what the sentence said. So we can exclude that from all possibilities. It drops away with a beautiful animation, and then we can test the rest of the statement. So does it mean that if you find a deviation from chance, does it have to mean that precognition is true? Yes, indeed. That is the logical consequence of the setup of this argument. Because if you notice a deviation from chance, it has to mean that you're in this box, so that has to mean that this box is true as well. There you go. So using the tree diagram might be useful, and of course this is a very misleading question, right? So I had to do something to make it a more exciting quiz, and basically it meant giving a long setup in which we only talked about fallacies, followed by an introduction about research which supposedly shows something very ridiculous, and then the argument turns out to be valid, right? So it's a bit of a setup. All right, I hope that explains the answers to you. All right, so another formal fallacies. Dictionaries have this is from some recent experiences I had talking to my colleagues over the email. Dictionaries have never been allowed for use during exams in year 2 of the psychology bachelor. SSR is part of year 2 of the psychology bachelor. Dictionaries shouldn't be allowed during the SSR exam. All right, so what fallacy do you recognize? Indeed, Faye, could you illustrate your answer?
I don't know the exact term, but two premises are both descriptive, so they describe what is the case in this case, and the conclusion is prescriptive, so it's like what should be done, and
Right.
you can't say that something should be done just from two descriptive premises.
Yeah, excellent answer. You were unsure about the correct terms, and if you look at the group chat, some other people have said ought from is, but if I were to ask you why can't you conclude that something ought to be done from the fact that something is the case, then your explanation would be spot on in terms of descriptive and prescriptive premises. Thank you. Another way of explaining why this is indeed a formal fallacy is that if you were to assume, well, perhaps some extra premise was implied, right? So what I added this third premise. The first two are still the same. Dictionaries have never been allowed. SSR is part of the psychology bachelor, and we're still concluding that they shouldn't be allowed on the basis of that experience. And then we do offer a connection between the premises and the conclusion by adding anything that has never been allowed in year 2 of the bachelor should never be allowed. That just makes a connection between the premises and the conclusion, but at the cost of a very dubious premise. I'm sorry, I'm in the way again. That's easier. So I could give a counterexample, right? So we move from dictionaries to being allowed to work on laptops. Students have never been allowed to work on their own laptops during exams in year 2 of the psychology bachelor. SSR is, so the rest is the same. So we would have to conclude, assuming P3 is true, that students shouldn't be allowed to work on their laptops during the SSR exam, which just shows that P3 wouldn't be true in all cases at all times, right? So that's what I was trying to show. To illustrate to you, if we go back to the original argument, why this argument isn't valid. So it isn't valid because the connection between P1, P2, and the the conclusion is missing, right? The first two premises are descriptive and the conclusion is prescriptive, and you have to offer a connection between them before you can conclude that the argument is valid. You could force an implicit premise in there and make it valid if you were so inclined on the basis of the context of the original text. Then what you get is this overview that we talked about, but that would be at the cost of a very dubious premise that would make the argument valid but unsound in this case. All right, and this is what the book does as well in a lot of cases. So even when they're talking about different fallacies, they often add an implicit premise that is often implied, but not always. I guess in the case of ought from is, people just skip this part and they just naturally directly assume that the conclusion follows from the premises. But I was just trying to show you why that connection is lacking by showing you what should have been there if there was a connection implied, and that connection is false. All right. Deriving ought from is indeed. So if somebody were to argue on the basis of the information here, so there's some information, a cab was involved in a hit and run, two cab companies, the green and the blue, operate in the city, 85% of the cabs in the city are green, 15% are blue, a witness identified the cab as blue. The court tested the reliability of the witness under the same circumstances that existed on the night of the accident and concluded that the witness correctly identified each one of the two colors 80% of the time and failed 20% of the time. And then somebody goes on to argue on the basis of this information. P1, the witness says the taxi was blue. P2, the eyewitness correctly identifies blue 80% of the time. Therefore, the taxi was perhaps probably true. All right, Levi, could you illustrate or explain why you chose the base rate fallacy?
Yeah, so I thought it was a base rate because it's I don't know, it's based on the probabilities, and the argumentation doesn't consider the probabilities of what portions of the cabs in the city are what colors.
Right.
It only considers the probability of the person guessing it correctly.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you. That was a good explanation. Basically, what we're saying is that in this argument, the base rate information that is given here in the 85-15% breakdown is missing from the assumptions in this argument. So if you're on the lookout for, hey, when would this argument be forceful, you would have to know the probability of the taxi being blue given that the eyewitness says that the taxi was blue. Right? So what's the probability of the conclusion given that the first premise is true? And therefore, we need to inverse conditional probabilities, right? Because the second premise only gives us the inverse. Again, I'm in the way. So premise one says that the witness says blue. Premise two is the probability that witness would say that taxi is blue given that the taxi was indeed blue is 80%. And then we're concluding the taxi is blue. So this is an important step, that you learn to recognize that the information given here about the witness being correct can be translated to a type of conditional probability depicted here. And that you recognize that what we need to know is the probability that the taxi is blue given that the witness says it's blue, and that what we have is the inverse. And what you need to recognize for recognizing the base rate fallacy is realizing that you can inverse those probabilities without having or taking into account that base rate, which hasn't been done in this example. That's why, indeed, it's an example of the base rate fallacy. And indeed, a connection is missing between the premises and the conclusion. And that connection is the base rate information that we need to be able to say something about the probability of the conclusion being true, given that the premises are true, which is what ascertaining forcefulness is all about. So if you were so inclined, you could calculate the actual probability. I know some of you already have, right? Because you're so eager to calculate conditional probability. Who isn't? It's a favorite pastime of mine, at least. Or you could use the frequency tree and you could fill in the base rate, the sensitivity, and the specificity. So we have all potential taxis or cabs, and some of which are blue. 15% out of 100 is 15 are blue, and 85 out of 100 are green. Of those 15 blue taxis, the witness will say about 12 that they are indeed blue, and about 3 he will be wrong, or she will be wrong and say that they are not blue. And of the 85, the witness will say that 68 are indeed not blue, or green in this case. And, oh, I'm sorry, I used the frequency tree of another example, and I haven't changed the Eaton to says blue. So imagine that this says blue. And I haven't changed the percentage. Oh, I did. Right, that I did change the calculation, but I didn't change the upper row of the box. In any case, if you apply the calculation correctly, you should come up with a conditional probability of 41%, which is indeed below that threshold. The true positive, false negative, true negative, and false positive BRIT are what the acronym stand for here. I've included it. I haven't mentioned it explicitly, but we'll return to that once in block 2. We're going to apply this type of frequency tree to reasoning about null hypothesis testing. So what can we and can't we conclude on the basis of alpha, or the specificity of your test, beta, the sensitivity of your test. The threshold is above 50%, so it should be higher than 50%. Sure. Okay. Anyway, so this is an example of how you could calculate it, and I mean, you could be more intuitive in recognizing that if somebody says to you, well, I've interviewed all successful people and they all share this trait, right? So the probability of having these 8 traits, given that you're successful, is very high. You should recognize when somebody's trying to conclude on the basis of that the inverse has the same probability, that we're skipping a couple of steps, right? So you know that to be able to inverse conditional probabilities, you need to know the sensitivity, the specificity, and the base rate, and just one of these 3 was provided here, right? So you recognize, no, this is not forceful. This is one of the forms of pseudo-reasoning, one of the formal fallacies. It's the form of base rate error. And you can apply the same with the frogs and the bouncing balls, right? So we first analyzed this as a form of deductive reasoning, right? So if positive effect, then probably, and if positive effect, then LLD, therefore positive effect. But you can also translate that to an inductive form and say that if positive effect, then probably this form of brain activity. So the fact that I observed this form of brain activity, does that mean that it's probably true that somebody experiences positive effect? No, not really, because again, we're inversing. What we need to know is the probability of positive effect given that form of brain activity, LLD. And we only have the inverse. And to inverse that conditional probability, we need the sensitivity, the specificity, and the base rate. And those aren't provided. That doesn't necessarily have to mean that you get exact probabilities every time you need to reason about these type of questions, but you could use that as an intuition, right? So you should use that as an intuition that if somebody tries to argue that given this form of brain activity, it's highly likely that somebody is experiencing this specific form of psychological process, like experiencing positive effect, you should have that frequency tree in your head, as it were, lighting up and realizing that, well, what are the odds of showing the same pattern in the data given that something else is the case than the stuff we're interested in, right? And if that's not provided, even on an intuitive level, without exact probabilities, it's difficult to argue that this type of brain activity would show that this type of process is taking place, because other explanations or other processes that could yield the same results aren't even considered. All right, that brings us to the 25th question in the weekly assignment. And I think also the answer to some of you might have struggled with this. So the solution for the WA3 question in the 25 is you recognize the example, right? So there was an argument that included different information, and all the information was there. The sensitivity was provided, the specificity was provided, the base rate was provided, and what was asked of you is to assess this argument. So you have to know every time I ask you assess an argument, you start with the logical assessment, right? And the first step of logical assessment is asking, is the conclusion necessarily true if the premises were to be true? That's the first step we're going to check. And to know if that's the case, we need to calculate that conditional probability. What is the probability that I, Shinkes, will survive given all the information in the premises, right? And turns out, so the probability of living or surviving given that you've been eaten. So we can calculate that, right? So you have all the stuff you need, all the 3 ingredients, you plug that into your frequency tree and you make your calculations. And because there's a beautiful symmetry in this frequency tree, right? So the 10% times 90% and the 90% times 10%, you should realize even without grabbing your calculator that the odds that given that you're eaten, that you'll survive are identical to the odds, given that you've been eaten, that you'll die or not survive. So that's exactly 50%. Now let's go back to the argument. So, right, so what we've done is ascertain that we need to know what the probability is of somebody surviving given that they've been eaten by a flying shark. And we've seen that that probability is exactly 50%. So the conclusion says that the probability is exactly 50%. So does the conclusion necessarily have to be true given that the premises are true? Yes. It has to be necessarily true given the information in the premises. So it's a valid argument. We've did 2 things, and I think one of those 2 things might have thrown you off. So the first thing is that you need to realize that what do you need to know to assess whether there's a proper connection between the premises and the conclusion, a connection of validity in this case. Well, you need to know this specific probability. We need to know that the probability described in the conclusion is indeed in line with this specific probability that we can calculate, right? And I think that's the most difficult step. And I think that, so I got some questions about it. So I can calculate a conditional probability, but what do I do with it? Well, you can check whether that means that the conclusion being offered is necessarily true or probably true given the information in the premises. In this case, the conclusion has to be true. All right, so hope that clears some things up, which is all related to those conditional probabilities, right? And the base rate error. So we started talking about the base rate error and learning to recognize that you need that base rate and that you can calculate conditional probabilities only if you have that base rate. And then I talked about the example from the weekly assignment in which all the information, including the base rate, was included in the argument. And then we can calculate the conditional probability using those 3 probabilities. And on the basis of that, we can ascertain whether the probability described in the conclusion is indeed exactly the same as the one that is implied or directly necessarily follows from the probabilities listed in the premises. Okay. We're still talking about formal fallacies, right? And this is another example from research, and we talked about this a couple of times, so I hope I can keep the introduction short. So somebody was interested in finding out whether psychological warmth and physical warmth are indeed connected, and they did so in the way that was described here. So there's a support for the proposed link between tactile temperature sensation, so physical warmth, and feelings of psychological warmth. And this, we can conclude that there's support for that link because the research has revealed that the insular cortex is implicated in processing both physical and psychological versions of warmth. So if physical warmth, then activity in the insula. If psychological warmth, then activity in the insula. Does that mean that physical warmth necessarily means that also psychological warmth is taking place? If we consider this as a deductive argument, what fallacy do you recognize? Probably won't recognize any of them because it isn't described in the book. So I'm just going to give this one away. If you view this argument, as I just showed you, as a deductive argument, you would call this the fallacy of the undistributed middle. And the reason why it's called the undistributed middle is because if you would depict the information in the premises as partly overlapping circles, so we know that there's a connection between psychological warmth and the inshallah, and we know there's a connection between physical warmth and the inshallah. It doesn't necessarily mean that physical warmth and psychological warmth overlap. There could be an area in the inshallah which is undistributed, right? So they could be completely unrelated, but still both take place in the inshallah is the point. And we call that the fallacy of the undistributed middle. And you've already seen this one, but I didn't ask you in the weekly assignment to ask you to say whether it's a fallacy of the undistributed middle, but you did hopefully realize that the argument here about people cheering and liking SEAL 2015, it's a bit of a dated question. Whether that argument was valid or forceful, and hopefully you concluded that that argument was invalid and not forceful, because it's an example of the same. So you could also use the Venn diagrams that we talked about on Friday to see why it is invalid, right? So if you apply all the stuff in the premises, so premise 1 means that if somebody's cheering, that person is liking the event on Facebook. So all the people in the cheering circle are located in this part of the liking circle, right? And if somebody loves the event, they will be liking it on Facebook. So all the people who love the event will be in this part of the liking circle as well. So we can scratch all the rest. So everything in cheering that's outside of like and everything in love that's outside of like does not exist, right? Because we know that those are empty. And this is the remainder situation if you apply both premise 1 and premise 2. Does it then necessarily follow that if somebody is cheering the event, does it necessarily mean that they have to love the event? Well, not really, right? It could be the case that cheering and loving overlap, that somebody who is cheering is in this area, but it could also be the case that they're outside of the loving area and only in the cheering and the liking area. Right? So I've tried to show you the same thing twice, why the argument isn't valid, and that you can use Venn diagrams to show why it isn't valid. And that this is a case of the undistributed middle, which basically means that the fact that both cheering and loving are taking place in the liking circle doesn't necessarily mean that they two are connected. And Britt, it is forceful, do you think? But for it to be forceful, and I'm not going to talk about that in detail, but it is a good question. But we can pick that up later if you'd like. But if you want to make this into a forceful argument, you would need those conditional probabilities again, right? So you would need to know to what extent the different circles indeed overlap or not. And we don't know that on the basis of this. What? It says all people. Well, I'll check it out later. It's a good remark, Britt, but in most cases, you would, well, the take-home message for now is if you were to see this as a probabilistic argument, so you're trying to gauge the forcefulness of the argument, you would need to base rate the sensitivity and the specificity to be able to inverse those probabilities and to get to the conclusion. And that's why you wouldn't be allowed to say that this is forceful as well. So, not valid, not forceful. So, we talked about recognizing different forms of pseudo-reasoning, and as indicated at the beginning, there are 3 different forms to look out for. The first one are formal fallacies, in which there is a lack of a proper connection between the premises and the conclusion. And we talked about different examples of that type of pseudo-reasoning. So those examples are all forms of reasoning that are either invalid or